Good afternoon and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for this congressional briefing, Radioactive Contamination of U.S. Food and Water and What Congress Can Do About It. This briefing features leading researchers who will detail implications of continuing radiation contamination and exposure, followed by advocates who will focus on policy implications for our food and potential next steps that Congress can take to address this issue. The briefing is organized by the Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, FFAN, a project of the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, and co-sponsored by the NGOs Beyond Nuclear, Citizens for Health, Ecological Options Network, San Clemente Green, Food and Water Watch, and Physicians for Social Responsibility National, as well as PSR's Greater Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco Bay Area chapters. Thank you to all of them. If you wish to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box as chat has been disabled for this briefing. If you are congressional or agency staff or members of the media, it helps respondents if you identify yourself when asking your questions. You can ask a question at any time. The question and answer session will begin after all presentations have concluded. As follow-up after the briefing, we will send additional information and links to the email from which you registered. Thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. Arjun Makhijani, President of the Institute for Energy and Environmental Research in Tacoma Park, Maryland. He has his PhD from the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at the University of California, Berkeley, in 1972, specializing in nuclear fusion. Dr. Makhijani has served on federal advisory committees, and for over a decade, he was one of the lead scientists on a team providing scientific support to the Presidential Advisory Board on Radiation and Worker Health, which oversees cancer compensation for nuclear weapons workers. He's written widely on radiation-related issues, including on the impacts of nuclear weapons testing. He served on the expert panel advising the Pacific Islands Forum on the proposed discharge of radioactive water from the stricken Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan. His most recent book on radiation-related issues is Exploring Tritium Dangers. Dr. Makhijani has testified before Congress, appeared on ABC World News Tonight, CBS's 60 Minutes, NPR, and other media. He was elected a Fellow of the American Physical Society in 2007. Welcome, Dr. Makhijani.
Thank you very much, Cindy. I'm going to focus on tritium today. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. Thank you for inviting me to this, and I'd welcome any questions. I focused on tritium for a number of reasons. Radiation protection has focused on cancer risk. Damage focus has been on the nuclear DNA, which has repair capabilities, not on mitochondrial DNA. We have a lot of mitochondrial DNA, which we inherit from our mothers. They are in the cytoplasm of the cell, not the nucleus. The most remarkable thing I think about mitochondrial DNA is the core of our energy system that enables our hearts to beat, for us to walk, for us to talk, eyes to blink. Everything that requires energy comes through largely comes through the mitochondria. That's what digests our food. It's sort of the refinery of the food system that converts the food we eat into usable energy. And it's common to all plants and animals. It's a very, very remarkable thing. It's also the communication system between the environment outside us, the air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the nuclear DNA. Ecosystems are also seriously underprotected. Reproductive and food web considerations are slight to nil, and I'll give you an example of that. Tritium is radioactive hydrogen. When it combines with oxygen, it makes radioactive water. It's not a contaminant in water. The water itself, the stuff of life, becomes radioactive. And so then it pervades the whole body because adults are 60% water, fetuses are a lot more, 80%, at some points, maybe more. There are no regulatory protections for pregnant women in the general public and their fetuses, despite the fact that many radionuclides cross the placenta. Tritium is the most ubiquitous pollutant in the nuclear age from nuclear weapons, as well as nuclear power, and that's why I wrote a book about it. So here are some information about radionuclides that cross the placenta, go from the mother to the fetus, and can create all kinds of problems, risk all kinds of problems. H is hydrogen, T is tritium, a radioactive isotope of hydrogen, H2O is radioactive water. OBT is organically bound tritium. When you have radioactive water, it becomes part of our hydrocarbon molecules. We are hydrocarbon molecules. Are carbohydrates and proteins and fats that are in our body. And as you can see, even if the mother has radioactivity in her body before pregnancy, it transfers to the fetus. Intakes prior to pregnancy affect the fetus. Intakes during pregnancy also affect the fetus. And these are just a few examples. And the remarkable thing about tritium and organic carbon is the concentration in the fetus is actually bigger per unit mass, per ounce or per pound, is greater than the concentration in the mother because there's more water in the fetus. So this is a diagram of a cell. The two red circled parts, this part is the nucleus. We talk about the double helix. That's where that is. Number 9 is the mitochondria. That's the energy system. It has its own DNA. There are hundreds to thousands of copies in each cell. That's what it takes to convert food into usable energy. And each one of them has a very simple circular DNA. And this is common between all plants and animals. So when you're affecting human beings, you're also affecting ecosystems. This is how tritium cycles through the agricultural system. That's because it's water and becomes part of the hydrological cycle. So tritium damages mitochondria in a very particular way, largely by ionizing water, splitting apart water into H and OH. So H2O becomes H and OH. OH is extremely reactive. It's also produced as part of our normal metabolic processes, but when we have tritium or other radioactive materials or some other pollutants, we create excess oxidative stress. That is what causes the damage. And the hydroxyl radicals chemically damage the mitochondrial DNA, but they're produced by radiation. They're also produced by other pollutants in the body. So in the case of tritium, we have clear evidence and mechanisms for how its impact adds to other pollutant impacts. So here are the reproductive risks of radioactivity outside or inside the body, but inside the body, it affects more because directly inside the cell. Early failed pregnancies, that means the fertilized cell may not implant, or after implantation in the first few weeks, there may be a failed pregnancy, a miscarriage. Malformations, this also happens during periods of organ formation, which are also in the early weeks of pregnancy, up to 15 weeks, except for the brain, which goes on develops longer. There's clear evidence of severe neurological damage, especially what the International Commission called severe mental retardation, defined as an individual, quote, an individual unable to form simple sentences, to solve simple problems in arithmetic, to care for himself or herself, or was unmanageable or institutionalized, unquote. Can damage ova and sperm and create multi-generational risks. So the severe neurological damage has been documented in Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors and women who were pregnant and whose babies survived to be born and were studied in the 1950s. There are also reproductive risks to other creatures. So I said, we share a lot with other creatures. And recently, damage to fish eggs, damaged eggs, and more dead eggs was documented with water contamination at 2/3 of the US drinking water standards. We allow bodies of animals such as owls to have hundreds of times the drinking water standard in their bodies, according to DOE guidelines, which is why I said ecosystems are basically not protected by current guidelines. And there are no actual enforceable standards in that regard, to my knowledge. Standards are not set to protect pregnant women or their fetuses or ecosystems. They're set for cancer. But there are many endpoints of genetic damage that are more vulnerable to radiation than cancer. Internal radiation, for instance, causes 20 times the damage of external gamma radiation, damage from plutonium, for example. But certain kinds of damage can be hundreds of times or thousands of times greater, but we don't regulate for that. We don't even regard that in the regulatory system. Another point is that mitochondrial DNA, being very simple, does not have the powerful repair mechanisms of nuclear DNA. And so when we're regulating to protecting against cancer and nuclear DNA, we're missing large parts of the radiation protection problem. So radiation protection is seriously deficient so far as reproductive issues and ecosystem protection are concerned. And tritium is of great concern because the most ubiquitous pollutant and is water. So here I've tried, and my colleagues have tried for 25 years to get the national academies to explicitly address the issues of radionuclides that cross the placenta. The problem of severe malformations due to radiation has been known and recognized going back to the 1950s when it was assessed in relation to fallout from testing. Pregnant women in the general public are not covered by any specific protective regulation. We should tighten our existing regulations in order to recognize that we're not protecting, in some ways, the most vulnerable, because fetuses' cells are dividing rapidly, their organs are forming, they don't have the repair mechanisms. And so I recommend two things: a comprehensive regulatory effort, and in the case of tritium, tightening of the standard from 20,000 picocuries per liter in the United States to 400 picocuries per liter. It's not going to shut down the nuclear industry. It's not, the natural background concentrations of tritium are in the 20 to 30 range. So it will still be many times. In the ocean, it's maybe in the few picocuries per liter. And much of that is the residual from nuclear testing. The California public health goal is 400 picocuries per liter. I've given you the reference, and DOE has agreed in the past to 500 picocuries per liter from runoff from Rocky Flats in Colorado when it was being cleaned up. So we have some precedent for that. I think we should be acting on it to protect our water resources and people and ecosystems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Makhijani. Our next speaker is Professor Bob Richmond, who is a research professor and director of the Kewalo Marine Laboratory, University of Hawaii at Manoa. He performed research in the Department of Radiation Biology and Biophysics at the University of Rochester Medical School on the uptake and accumulation of radionuclides in aquatic organisms, and his doctoral dissertation research on Eniwetok Atoll, a site of the U.S. nuclear testing program. He is a member of the Expert Scientific Advisory Panel to the Pacific Islands Forum on the discharge of radioactively contaminated water from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant into the Pacific, and is a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, an Aldo Leopold Fellow in Environmental Leadership, and a Fellow of the International Coral Reef Society. Welcome, Professor Richmond.
Thanks very much, Cindy. Can my screen be seen and can I be heard? Hearing nothing today. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. And I'd like to certainly thank and acknowledge the previous speaker, Dr. Arjun Makhijani. The two of us have served together on this panel for the Pacific Island Forum. And I agree with everything he said, that his knowledge about tritium in particular and radionuclides as they affect cells and people is very, very important. I'm giving the vision of a marine biologist who's looking at the concerns being raised. And for me, as a biologist, I see the real clear connection that ocean health and human health are inextricably linked, as well as the human rights that are attached to it and the quality of life issues. When we use the ocean as a dumping ground for things like radionuclides in Fukushima or any of the nuclear power plants that are adjacent to ocean bodies, it affects food security for the islands in which I do most of my work, cultural identity and practices. It truly is a matter of individual and community health, as Arjun spoke about. It also affects the economies because of fisheries, both those that are artisanal as well as large-scale fisheries. It affects the integrity of ecosystems that Arjun spoke about. But for me, it's also very much an intergenerational and trans-regional issue in this area, because what we do today is the legacy we leave for the future. And when you look at some of these radionuclides, half-lives can be fairly short, but they can be as long as that of carbon-14, 5,730 years. So these should not be trivialized by any stretch of the imagination. And this gets to the core of environmental sustainability. The present state of our oceans is in decline, and I deal with these data every day due to a variety of anthropogenic stressors. Obviously, most people are familiar with climate change affecting ocean acidification, elevated temperatures, sea level rise. All of these do affect the chemistry of the ocean, including the way in which radionuclides interact with organisms. We see overexploitation of fishery resources, pollution from a number of issues, including mercury, which no one ever expected to be able to show up in the concentration of fish the way it is. And this is also what we're going to be seeing with radionuclides and already have. Plastics, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, nutrients are all contributing to the decline of ocean ecosystem health and the people who depend on them. And these are cumulative impacts. If you add on more radionuclide stress, we need to reduce stressors right now and not add more to fragile marine ecosystems. In terms of the actual radioactivity discharge into the Pacific, whether it's in Fukushima, Japan, or off of California, or anywhere in between, as I mentioned, radionuclide affects environmental health and human health. These are truly transboundary and transgenerational issues. These chemical biological interactions are where I do a lot of my work. And as I mentioned, we can look at the history of the interaction between pollutants in the environment and environmental health. Mercury is accumulating in fish to the extent where we already have to suggest limitations on the amount of larger tuna, albacore tuna that people take, especially as Dr. Makhijani mentioned, pregnant women, lactating women, and young children. We've seen this with mercury, DDT, what we call the forever chemicals that are showing up now in bloodstreams of people across the world. We don't know what the effects of climate change will be on the fate of radionuclides, and this is a big concern, but it's likely to increase because of increased temperatures and changes in pH. And as a result, it has ecological, cultural, and economic implications. And the reality is better options simply exist. And Dr. Makhijani led the effort to put together an alternative of how these radionuclides could be bound up into concrete for use on sites, limited access to people like the Fukushima site and other sites there, which prevents these from becoming biologically available. My biological concerns, like those that were mentioned previously, is dilution is a chemical process, and it's not what occurs in the ocean by any means. Bioaccumulation is a biological process, and as soon as radionuclides get into the ocean, they will be taken up by phytoplankton and other organisms. The ocean is not a sterile aquarium, and once these radionuclides go into the ocean, they are taken up, they are trophically transferred throughout the food web, and they can be bioaccumulated and biomagnified in organisms. The discharge for Fukushima is planned to go on for over 30 years, and we also see many of these discharges that are occurring today have been going on for decades and will for decades to come. When radionuclides are detected in fish, it's too late. There's no way of putting the genie back in the bottle. And as Dr. Makhijani mentioned, when we talk about relative biological effectiveness, the term is RBE. Oftentimes, many of the radionuclides that we're discussing are considered low-level beta emitters, but they're extremely hazardous when ingested in food or inhaled, because inside the body, there is no protection, as Dr. Makhijani mentioned, certainly for the mitochondrial DNA, which is incredibly important in cell function, immunology, energy, everything that a cell in an organism needs is handled that way, but it can also cause nuclear damage that can be passed down and damage to cells in the body. In addition to tritium, one of the ones we're very concerned about is strontium-90. The nickname is the bone seeker because it attaches to bone as a replacement for calcium. And the last place you want a ionizing radiation emitter is adjacent to where your blood cells are being formed on a regular basis. Organically bound tritium is a serious concern for the ocean because of the way in which tritium can be taken up by organisms. And this is not evenly distributed throughout the ocean. So this idea that the solution to pollution dilution does not hold up in the ocean at all. I just reviewed a couple of papers on where we expect these plumes to end up. They're going to be sitting right in the major fishing grounds for the Pacific. We estimate about 7 to 12 years is about when things are going to be at their peak. And once again, we already know what happens to many of these chemicals once they get into the ocean. They do end up in fish, and they end up in the people who eat these fish. Here's kind of a schematic of what we see. On the left-hand side are two molecules, a tritium and a carbon-14 molecule, and we're all based of hydrogen and carbon. That's what we're made of. These can be taken up and are taken up by phytoplankton in the top panel there, the beautifully symmetric green creatures there. Below that, that's a cartoon of zooplankton. I couldn't resist. I love the colors there. But the radionuclides can also be taken up into the sediment. And because there are a lot of organisms that live in the sediment, they're constantly turning it over. You can get quite a lot of accumulation of radionuclides in the sediment that become a long-term reservoir and source for releasing back into the ocean and to the organisms that live there. On the right side panel, everything from sea cucumbers to larval fish to adult fish are a pathway to get back into people. And as mentioned, once you ingest these radionuclides in food, it's a very dangerous situation for a variety of reasons. The problem that I see as a scientist is policy is not keeping up with the advances. Detection protocols and limitations to external detection are concerning, and cells are far better and far more sensitive to detecting the effects of ionizing radiation than many of the detectors, physical and chemical detectors we have. And the way in which they demonstrate that is through cellular damage and the processes for which all life depends. The term presently accepted standards is a very big concern because many of them are not sufficiently stringent or based on the best present available science. In my years of working in the field of ecotoxicology, we rarely see any relaxation of standards. Quite the opposite. We say, oh, it must be worse than we thought. We need to get better in terms of both detection and reduction.
Professor Richmond, 2 minutes.
Thank you. In addition, there are synergisms, antagonisms, and cumulative impacts that have to be considered and are not. And once again, the changing responses and the changing environment are often ignored. The Fukushima is one example of a radiation discharge that violates the precautionary principle. The International Atomic Energy Agency has a bunch of general safety guidance documents. Number 8's violated. There's something called the ALARA principle, as low as reasonably achievable, which means no one should be exposed to radiation unless there is a direct benefit to them. That's in response to radiation therapy for cancer. Releasing into the ocean has no value to people. There's the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, the London Conventions and Protocol, a recently passed High Seas Treaty on Biodiversity Beyond National Borders. And the Pacific Islands Forum came up with a beautiful strategy for the blue continent, meaning the Pacific Ocean. This is the UN Ocean Decade. Everything that we see happening with this ocean dumping violates all of these policy elements. I'll end by saying that the issues for thought is that the constant monitoring does not prevent problems. It simply tells you when they occur. As I like to explain to people, brakes only work before you drive off the cliff, not on the way down. You're never going to get the genie back in the bottle once these radionuclides are in the ocean. This is a very big example of another unwanted byproduct of an industry that is difficult to deal with. And remember, it's not the individual ingredients alone, it's the soup. You can be within all established criteria, whether it be radionuclides or mercury or any other pollutant, but it's not individually that they matter as much as when you put them all together. And I'll end by saying the solution to pollution is not dilution, it's source control. These tragedies we're seeing in terms of release into the ocean are also opportunities. As I mentioned, this is UN Ocean Decade. we should be cleaning up the ocean, not adding more to it. Japan and the United States and all other nations that use nuclear energy can advance the way in which we deal with it because problems have occurred. These are not the first examples, nor they will be the last. And due to the transboundary and transgenerational nature of the problem, we really need new approaches and alternatives to ocean dumping. And this is the only, not only the right thing to do, but the only responsible way forward. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Richmond. I want to take a moment for a housekeeping item to inform our attendees that subtitles will be available in post. James Gormley, our next speaker, is President and Senior Policy Advisor with Citizens for Health, with an active membership of over 100,000 health-conscious consumers. As editor-in-chief of Better Nutrition magazine, James was part of a small cadre of journalists who helped change the editorial landscape of natural products industry magazines by pioneering science-centered coverage. James headed up regulatory and scientific affairs for Nutrition 21, where he managed US and global regulatory submissions. Through his reporting and editorial positions at several health and nutrition publications, he regularly shined a light on supplement misinformation. He is a managing board member of the National Health Research Institute, which began as a nonprofit arm of the Citizens for Health Education Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Gormley.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity. So, as our previous speakers have very astutely observed and summarized, we have a very serious problem of radioactivity following the Fukushima, well, in general, but I would say in this case, following the Fukushima disaster that occurred. And just looking at one specific country or one specific solution is not going to be the answer. We're going to need to have a multinational approach to improving the situation in terms of assessment, in terms of radioactivity mitigation efforts, in terms of source control, and in terms of developing alternative methods to storing or otherwise mitigating nuclear waste and radioactive waste. So that in this case, this waste started out with hundreds of thousands of tons, I believe it was, of radioactive water that poured into the Pacific by the Fukushima prefecture. So basically, in the US, from a US perspective, it's important that we adopt a whole of government approach, not just looking at the EPA, not just looking at NOAA or DOA, or even FDA in terms of the food and water. We really need to combine coordinate all the efforts and come up with a realistic approach to dealing with the fallout from the Fukushima disaster. So since, as I mentioned, Japan was the epicenter of the disaster that was obviously caused by the tsunami, Japan has taken some steps important steps to try to contain and mitigate the radioactive leakage. They have, it's something that affects people, but it's something that also affects countries. In this case, Japan, where you find China and Russia banning the sale, or China banning the sale of the import of contaminated fish, sushi, etc. And then you have Russia with very, very serious restrictions in terms of its what it will allow from Japan. So these effects that we're talking about, yes, the most important effect is the effect on people, bioaccumulation in the oceans, bioaccumulation in people and in their organs, pathological effects, epidemiological effects, but it also, as I said, has effects that hurt the economies of nations from Japan, and by extension, it can be the United States as well. So we have to look at decontamination, waste management, environmental monitoring, and there needs to be data sharing, full transparency between Japan, the US, and the Pacific nations in terms of any oceanographic research that's conducted, radiological research in reference to that, and also maybe new technologies or new methods for mitigating and capturing nuclear contaminated water, or those substances themselves, whether it's cesium-134, 137, et cetera. So in terms of monitoring programs, sharing scientific expertise, and developing joint response strategies are all going to be important in addressing contamination and to protect marine ecosystems. So in terms of the Food and Drug Administration, going back to the US, the FDA should enhance its monitoring and testing of seafood and other food products imported from the Pacific region to ensure that they meet safety standards for radioactivity. Of course, these safety standards need to be improved. They also need to provide clear and transparent information to the public about the safety of food products, including guidelines on consumption, but also regarding potential risks. The agency should collaborate with other agencies and international bodies to research the effects of radioactivity on food safety and to develop methods to reduce contamination. The agency also needs to update and enforce, as mentioned earlier, regulations on permissible levels of radioactivity in food products to protect public health. And these should be based on very low levels, such as the levels that Japan has for its own food products, not the level that we currently have in the US. In terms of international standards, Codex guidelines allow the adoption of different national values. So in other words, they recognize that individual countries have their own responsibility and freedom to set their own values for their food products, or food products that they allow for consumption and for import in their own member states. So in the case of widespread radioactive contamination, nations should take into account vulnerable population groups such as children, proximity to the accident site, or when contamination levels in certain foods persist at higher levels than the minimum levels. The International Commission on Radiological Protection, ICRP, provides information for the protection of the public during emergencies. The Commission continues to recommend that national authorities, whether it's ministries of health or the US FDA, that they set reference levels for the highest planned residual dose in the band of 20 to 100 millisieverts. When the radiation source is under control, contaminated areas may remain. Authorities will often implement all necessary protective measures so that people don't need to leave where they're actually living. But again, they are recommending that the levels be as low as humanly possible. In conclusion, addressing the issue of radioactivity in the Pacific Ocean following the Fukushima disaster it's really a complex task that requires a unified and collaborative approach. But fortunately, by working together, Japan, Pacific nations, and the United States in particular, with the involvement of key government agencies, can significantly mitigate the impact of this environmental crisis. The FDA's role in ensuring the safety of our food supply is essential to protect public health. So let's all commit to a concerted effort to safeguard our oceans and all future generations. I'd like to thank you, and I would direct you for more information to the Citizens for Health website at citizens.org, or my website, jamesgormley.com. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gormley. Our final speaker is Ms. Kimberly Roberson. She is a project director of Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network. Formerly a campaigner with Greenpeace USA, Kimberly worked as a certified diet counselor and nutrition educator while serving on the board of the National Association of Nutrition Professionals. In March 2011, she petitioned for better food regulations due to Fukushima, which led to the formation of the Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, or FFAN. Kimberly helped organize the FFAN Coalition to petition the Food and Drug Administration for more stringent regulations of man-made radiation in the food supply due to nuclear accidents. Welcome, Ms. Roberson.
Thank you, Cindy, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. As Cindy mentioned, I am the project director of the Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, also known as FFAN. The FFAN Coalition consists of Beyond Nuclear, Citizens for Health, Ecological Options Network, and the Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network. The late Jim Turner, original narrator and former chairman of Citizens for Health, filed a Food and Drug Administration citizen petition on behalf of the FFAN Coalition in 2013. Jim spent his entire career advocating on the behalf of the health and safety of consumers. The FDA is legally required to respond to a citizen petition, and to date, we've received only an interim letter stating that more time is needed. The FFAN Coalition strongly feels that 11 years is long enough to wait. During that time, Tokyo Electric and Power Company, or TEPCO, Japan's utility, has struggled to get the situation at Fukushima under control, and there is no end in sight. They say it will take 30 to 40 years, but no one really knows for sure. In August of 2023, nearly 1 year ago, TEPCO began systematically dumping radioactive wastewater from Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific that is only partially filtered. TEPCO filled over 1,000 tanks so far with radioactive wastewater, and more is being added every day. And there are hundreds of thousands of gallons in each of those tanks. Groundwater from elevated terrain behind Fukushima Daiichi travels down to the site, especially after it rains. Tritium, one of the radionuclides discussed earlier, is very difficult to filter, and TEPCO is not currently attempting it. While cesium is a radionuclide at the center of the FDA petition, tritium is also an urgent concern. And where one radionuclide is present, others are as well. At present, the U.S. has among the highest allowable levels for man-made radiation from nuclear accidents in food in the world. It's important to note that this is very different from a type of food processing known as food irradiation. Food irradiation exposes food to ionizing radiation to reduce germs that can cause food poisoning and leaves no detectable levels of radiation behind in food. Conversely, radioactive fallout that occurs after a nuclear accident is absorbed by animals and plants when exposed and retains radionuclides when consumed by other animals and humans. A becquerel is a unit of measurement, and 1 becquerel is 1 atomic disintegration per second. The U.S. non-binding level for man-made radiation from nuclear accidents, cesium, is 1,200 becquerel per kilogram for all citizens, adults and children. By comparison, Japan's level for their adult citizens is 150 for baby food. Again, that's 100 becquerel per kilogram for adults and 50 becquerel per kilogram for baby food. This means that food that is too radioactive for their country can be legally exported to ours. Also, it has been reported that food, including Fukushima seafood, that Japan would ordinarily export to countries that have instituted food bans against Japan's radioactive food products is now being sold and served to U.S. military service members and their families in Japan. The National Academies of Sciences Biologic Effects of Ionizing Radiation, or BEER-7, report states that there is a linear dose-response relationship between exposure to ionizing radiation and the development of solid cancers in humans. It is unlikely that there is a threshold below which cancers are not induced. Radioactive contamination in the food chain began with above-ground testing in the 50s, increased with accidents, including Chernobyl, and continues to increase with Fukushima and on to whenever the next nuclear accident takes place. Also, venting and discharging of radiation is routine in operating nuclear reactors. Tritium is not filtered. It's a hydrogen atom and is extremely difficult to separate from water. According to the European Commission-supported Chernobyl Ecology and Health Project, pathologies at low levels of cesium can include hormone imbalances, angina, diabetes, and hypertension. As cesium passes out of the body, its radioactivity starts to damage kidneys and the bladder, which in turn damages the body's ability to rid itself of the cesium. Radioactivity has also been associated with perinatal deaths and childhood leukemia. Meanwhile, what is being done to inform and protect U.S. consumers, including pregnant women and their families? In the months after the initial hydrogen explosions and triple nuclear meltdowns at Fukushima, some grocers in the prefecture measured their produce for sale and then placed radiation count levels on signs alongside prices. A shop owner interviewed said that he hoped the practice would catch on widely, however it didn't. Citizen scientists, led by worried mothers, built a testing lab and began measuring their own food for radiation. I mention this because it has been done, and while that may not happen in the US for the foreseeable future, the FDA should widely test food for man-made radiation like cesium, as asked for in the FDA petition. Food imported from Japan should, at the very least, adhere to that country's standard of 100 becquerel for adults, 50 for young children, before being exported to the United States. Now more than ever, it's important to explain what the FFAN coalition asked for with the petition and why it is so crucial to significantly lower 1,200 becquerel per kilogram. At the time, and unbeknownst to the coalition, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, or IPPNW, in Germany asked for a very similar level, 8 becquerel for children, 16 for adults. So that would be 8 becquerel per kilogram of cesium for children, 8 becquerel per kilogram, 16 becquerel per kilogram for adults, Food from Japan should be exported at the very least at the levels they set for their own country of 100 becquerel per kilogram for adults and 50 for children. Congress should direct FDA to start the process to do adequate testing and monitoring and determine a viable limit, and meanwhile also to verify that food imported from Japan does not exceed Japan's own limits. Radioactive contamination of food and water is a significant and growing problem. The public has a right to information about it. So FDA needs to confront the issue, and we're asking Congress to direct FDA to do so. So in conclusion, since the FFAN Coalition filed the FDA citizen petition in 2013, worldwide radioactive contamination has continued to increase. It is imperative that Congress and FDA recognize and respond to the urgent question of how this may be impacting American families now and in the future. We are asking Congress to direct the FDA to establish a credible process and to determine a viable radiation limit for food that isn't merely advisory, but actually binding. The current 1,200 becquerel per kilogram DIL, or derived intervention level, is merely a guideline and comes with no enforcement or labeling. Consumers have no information about radioactive contamination of their food or how to make choices about it. The FDA petition was filed in 2013 and includes good, clear language asking for monitoring and testing in the ongoing wake of the Fukushima disaster. Over a decade later, it absolutely needs to happen, and we are asking Congress to exercise its oversight and direct and fund FDA to start a credible process to confront this significant and growing public health threat. So I wanted to also mention that you can reach me directly with any questions The email address is ffan0311@gmail.com. That's ffan0311@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Roberson. We will now begin the question and answer session. So again, if you wish to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box, as chat has been disabled for this briefing. If you are a congressional or agency staff or members of the media, it helps respondents if you identify yourself when asking your questions. If I could now have the panelists turn on their microphones, we'll have a first question. Let's see. The IAEA approved Japan's latest dumping campaign, claiming that such contamination did not violate its own IAEA standards. The U.S. has taken no action to compel better science or leadership from the IAEA. Any options or strategies for actual, factual, international leadership out there? I see that Bob wants to take that question.
Thanks. I'll go ahead and also defer if Arjun wants to add in, but you have to be careful to look at what the IAEA actually said. They did not approve of the discharge. They don't have that authority. That stays with the National Regulation Authority for Japan. What they did say is that if you, that they neither approved nor did they recommend it. They say that they're not a regulatory body in terms of not being able to give options. Their only statement was, if everything goes to plan, they will likely remain within allowable standards. That is no indication of health whatsoever. So a lot of misinformation about their approval. They didn't approve it. They did not recommend it. They did not provide alternatives. The only thing that they say is if everything goes to plan. And I'll turn it over to my colleague. But when we looked at everything that led to this disaster, and there's some very good articles on the internet, all you have to do is look at, was Fukushima preventable? When we were there and I had a chance to go visit the site, it's not a matter of if something is going to go wrong, it's when something is going to go wrong. And the idea that it's going to meet presently accepted standards is absolutely no indication that it will actually be safe. So I see that my dear colleague has his hands up, so I'll turn it over to Dr. Makhijani.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, the process with the IAEA and the government of Japan was quite poor. I'll put up some links in the chat. The expert panel of which Bob and I were a part actually wrote a critique of how the IAEA approached this. First of all, they ruled out the benefit cost requirement that there should be some benefit to the activity. Before starting the process, they said Japan has already decided to dump, so we're just going to say, you know, whether this kind of dumping or that kind of dumping might be better. That's a little bit of a cartoon, but that's the essence of it. The justification requirement was ruled out from the beginning, which is at the core of their own regulations and guidelines. I spent a lot of time reading their documents and writing about it, you know, and drafting and working with the panel to put that analysis forward. The IAEA, the dumping is not in accord with the letter or spirit of several IAEA requirements and guidelines, and yet the IAEA sort of gave it a green light, which I think was egregious. They never did answer our questions. And as I said, we don't think that the IAEA green lighted this to the extent that it did. And it kind of did give its blessing in a roundabout way, in violation of its own guidelines. I thought it was an appalling process. We did talk directly with IAEA. They did not have answers to the serious questions we posed about their own guidelines. And here we are, the dumping has started. It should not have. The IAEA also said that we're not going to look at whether dumping can be avoided, for instance, by using the water to make cement for use on site. And no serious objection to our proposal was put forward. And so this dumping really can't still be stopped. It's supposed to go on for 30 years. It should be stopped. And I think the alternatives are out there. and the IAEA should also be called to account. It's also not a happy situation that the US kind of also agreed with Japan on the dumping when it should really have not agreed and objected.
Thank you for those answers. The next question is interesting because it frames radioactive contamination as potentially continually rising. And I guess what they mean is that is as radionuclides continue to be released into the environment from nuclear energy, military sites, and as reactors continue to run and new ones get built. And so the question is interesting in that it's saying, how would changing levels of radiation in the environment potentially affect how the FDA would frame protective standards? Would a protective standard be a moving isotope for cesium or tritium or other radionuclides like strontium, for instance? Arjun.
Actually, radioactivity decays, so it's emitted and also decays. So, for instance, nature makes tritium, but the amount of tritium that's natural in the environment doesn't increase because the amount that's made is very small every year. Less than a quarter of a pound approximately in the whole world. Is not the stock is not increasing because it's decaying. Now, if plutonium were being emitted, for instance, by continued nuclear weapons testing, that would increase the stock because plutonium decays very, very slowly. And during the period of atmospheric testing, it was continually increasing in the atmosphere. That's a little bit of a simplified version. So it's not necessarily true that, if the FDA put limit, that's at some point it'll be exceeded. We should not be dumping strontium and cesium and tritium from man-made sources into the environment. Most of it can be avoided. And FDA guidelines are for accidents, and they should be as tight as possible. As Kim has said, Japan has tighter limits than us. And we should be vigilant on how much we are allowing, even in accidental situations. So it's a more complicated question than simply radioactivity increasing in the environment from the nuclear industry. The standards we're advocating is not going to shut down it's going to make them do some things to protect the environment, but it's, in my opinion, well within their ability to do these things, and they're not doing them because they're not required.
The next question I'm going to raise from the question list is, what is the difference between setting a standard for releasing a pollutant versus setting a standard for something that's actually protective of human health? And I believe that, Arjun, you had talked about this earlier, and maybe James and Kim would also want to weigh in on this, because this is a question of an ongoing contamination situation for food and water and the environment.
Yeah, so what we do today is we don't actually practice environmental health. We practice pollution control. We should do pollution control. We should set limits on emissions and so on. And, so long as we have industry, there's going to be some. So pollution control limits are extremely important, pollutant by pollutant. But that doesn't protect environmental health. As Bob pointed out, we respond to the cumulative impact of all the environmental pollutants that are there. The umbilical cords of babies have lots and lots of contaminants. And so we need to start a process of environmental health in which we take into account the combined impacts of pollutants, and to develop the science. Actually, the science needs to be developed. Part of the reason we've been trying to push the national academies to address these issues. And in the meantime, we should have much more protective regulations, since we don't even have the adequate science, like to add up mercury and lead, for example, with tritium. We're not regulating for the way our bodies and ecosystems experience pollution.
Yeah, I want to make sure that Kim and James have an opportunity, since I've already spoken, if they want to jump in first, and then I'll add my 2 cents.
Well, I guess that's a question that maybe Bob would be better answering, because I'm not exactly sure. I think this 1200 becquerel per kilogram non-binding level was set quite a while ago. Nobody, I think, until now has really questioned it. How they came up with that number, I'm not really sure. And I don't think for a minute that we have food coming in to the United States that is at that level. I mean, it's possible, but we don't know until we have the monitoring, until we have the testing. And even then, a lot of testing needs to happen. It seems to me like it was almost an arbitrary number that was thrown out there and nobody really questioned it. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. James, you want to go ahead and go, and then I'll go after you?
Sure. I think one example of environmental versus human health in terms of a substance, I would look at something like chromium, where the toxic type of chromium is hexavalent chromium. You know, we all think of the Aaron Brockovich film.
Right.
Versus trivalent chromium, which is relatively benign and very important for nutrition. So, I mean, that's just one example, but I think when you look at bioaccumulation in kids, I think you can find negative effects from 11 becquerels per kilogram and above. And, you know, there are very serious developmental effects, for example, in children and in human health. Basically hypothyroidism, and a whole variety of other developmental disorders or deformities can occur. So Bob could shed more light on, you know, on that, but that's one thing I wanted to just bring up.
Thanks. So yeah, I'd like to follow up on what Arjun was saying too. We really need to move away from chemical metrics to biological metrics. You can meet all the chemical metrics that you want, and still the patient dies or is severely impaired. And so we have tools that are available now. Way before, when these standards were made, many of these tools were not available. And this was a point I made earlier, is that we have technologies and tools now for detection at the cellular level that would guide the principles of biological effect over the chemical metrics very effectively. For DNA, there are ways we use AP, Comet assay. There's a variety of ways. Arjun mentioned oxidative stress is a very good tool for determining the effects of ionizing radiation, and a lot of things can cause oxidative stress. And it was interesting talking with Dr. Chin Musso, who does tritium. Unfortunately, couldn't be on this panel, but we've been able to collaborate before. And he pointed out that the Chernobyl data was really interesting, that if they did the experiments in the laboratory where a lot of these standards are being developed, you're doing it in a vacuum where the only variable is that particular radionuclide. When they looked at the animals and plants, well, the animals primarily that were living in Chernobyl, the effect was 8 times greater on some of these metrics we use to look at cell health and organismal health, because every animal is either a predator or a prey. So you have oxidative stress going on all the time because you're either being chased or you're chasing something. All of us go through oxidative stress every day, whether we're climbing a set of stairs or we're going to a meeting with an administrator that we don't get along with. These are things that are going on all the time in the background, and then we're adding another layer of stress on top of it. And so these can be additive. And this is the concern, is many of the metrics that we're using are simply not giving us the information we need. We're not being able to determine at the levels of activity. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes it's not the individual ingredients, it's the soup. When we look at things like lead, cadmium, cesium, all these things that we measure in the environment, each one can be within the accepted standard of what is acceptable under those conditions. But you put them together and it's the soup that's causing the problem. And once again, you know, moving away from mortality to start to look at these indicators of compromised health in our lab, which is ecotox. Our kind of our catchphrase is death is a rather crude estimator of stress. That's why we have a whole variety of things we do at the human medical intervention level to look for blood sugar and blood pressure and a variety of other indicators of cellular dysfunction. We can do the same with ecosystems and organisms. And as Arjun said, these tools are available, but the industry is not being required to do any of these things. And that's very disturbing. We have the tools to be able to answer the question. We don't have the regulatory framework in which these tools can be applied.
Thank you, Bob, for that important and very salient answer. So I guess there's also a question of how easy it is for the public to take this upon themselves versus a federal government. So I know that Bob had just said that we can do these kinds of things. It sounds like we might be able to do them at the state and federal level, but how long will that take, versus how readily available testing might be for an individual. This was also a question in the questions, and I want to tell everyone that it's 3 p.m. right now, so maybe we answer this question as a final one and a roundup.
Well, I'd like to say that we will have the FDA petition in our follow-up email for people to go on and comment. We have over 1,560 comments so far, and that's taken a while to get. We also have some very, some brilliant comments that scientists have offered for FDA to look at. I think the more that people jump in now and continue to make their concerns heard, the better. We also have a companion petition at moveon.org for signature. So we have a comment petition, FDA citizen petition we filed to FDA. And if you go on there, you will see other comments and how other people have contributed. The Move On is simply a signature petition. And, picking up the phone and making phone calls, telling your friends, being careful about your food choices, just becoming proactive in this particular issue, because it does only seem to be getting worse over time. And it was right around this time last year that the dumping of 1.3 million tons into the Pacific with the tritium that's not being filtered commenced. And I believe they're on round 7 right now. So until it's stopped, until we put pressure on them, we're going to see more status quo. So I just hope that people will become involved. I hope that Congress will start asking more questions, taking it from there. I mean, that's one of the reasons we had this today, is to try to get the government more involved in this issue.
James.
Yes, this is going to be probably more for Bob and Arjun to finish up, but Eurofins, which actually is I have no tie to them. They do food and feed testing, but they that particular organization stated that there is no reliable method for consumers to have an analytical or a test kit, basically, where they can test the water and the food that they're consuming or that they're planning to consume. That may not be the case, and of course, they have a vested interest in saying that you should send it to analytical labs. But anyway, that was, I'd be interested in seeing what Bob or Arjun, if they know of some practical method that consumers can use to test or assess that.
I don't know of any practical method that you can test for these kinds of levels. There are the state of California guidelines. The link will be there in my slides. I think they'll be circulated. Other states can adopt those. New Mexico has tightened its own guidelines downstream of Los Alamos. That was a very complicated process of its Water Quality Commission. So it's difficult because radioactivity standards are preempted by the federal government, and I think trying to tighten them at the federal level is very difficult. It's been difficult enough to get an official recognition that regulations should be include children explicitly, for example. Just clarification on that question has been difficult. So I think at the federal level, that is a good place to start, but work at the federal level would be a good thing. I mean, there are local and state actions on non-radioactive things that have worked. Also, it may be useful to work on the chemical counterparts that do interact with tritium, like heavy metals, to work on that at the state level. I don't have any wisdom about the federal level that I can share with you given the present juncture.
I believe Bob mentioned earlier about mercury, and we've seen these kinds of regulations come into play before, and also DDT. That's something that Professor Tim Mousseau has talked about. So I don't know if we could use something like that as a model going forward, or I'm sure that we've learned along the way what can work and what can't. But this is definitely an issue for our time right now. It seems similar to other ones that we've dealt with before. And pregnant mothers are especially at risk. Children, women, it's urgent. It's an urgent issue that we need action on. It cannot be status quo anymore.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to point out that there were a number of questions that were very detailed, very complicated, and we will try to answer as many of those as we can. And I think that we should go ahead and conclude. We are technically 5 minutes over. So unless there's any other concluding statements that anyone would like to make, I will just say that there's some concern too in the questions about our basis for standards for radiation is still based on reference man, although there have been some adjustments made. But in my opinion, not enough. And I'm sure that other people would probably agree with that, although I don't want to speak for anyone. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there was that concern about the standards being set originally for reference man. I don't know if anybody else wants to follow up on that. And if not, we will go ahead and make the concluding statements for the briefing.
Cindy, I might compliment that just a little bit. These days, the average men and women in the radiation risk calculations, that's not good enough. As I said in my presentation, I think the question of pregnant women and their fetuses and the early malformations and early impacts is entirely ignored for the general public, not for nuclear weapons or nuclear workers. And that is a big gap, like the ecosystem gap, where we should start the process of reforming what we have and strengthening what we have.
And I think that is a perfect note to conclude on, Arjun. Thank you so much. So this concludes the question and answer section of this briefing. I would like to thank our briefers as well as Fukushima Fallout Awareness Network, which again is a project of the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy, and all of our co-sponsors. Presentations and other supporting material, including Dr. Makhijani's book, additional videos and research will be posted at the link on the concluding thank you slide. Thank you.